Season 14 is here, and
I ain't gonna lie, I'm getting cooked.
I figured I'd give you guys insight into how I'm trying to improve this season. So I'm going to go over 6 underrated tips that I'm using to take my game to the next level. I know these tips will help all players of any skill, so let's get into it. Tip number 1, I'm rotating early in Season 14. The zones close faster than they ever have before. In fact, 3 times faster. It used to take 180 seconds for the first ring to close, but now it only takes 60. This means that rotations have to be in the forefront of your mind as you land. If you're taking too long with either looting or fighting off drop, well, both of these will trip you up and usually set you up for a late rotation. Learning to wrap up fights faster goes a long way as you climb the ranks in Apex, because the higher you go up, the more and more teams are aware of third-partying each other. Rotating late this season is straight up asking for trouble, not only because round 1 Storm is doing more damage than before, but also because of the combination of the Storm and a team trying to fight you as they're rotating late can be extremely annoying. You also have teams that camp on the edge of the circle because they are looking for teams rotating late, and coming out of the storm when the enemy team has that leverage over you will be extremely difficult. One thing players tend to screw up is they think when the zone closes, that's when they should start their rotation. This isn't true for most rotations. In fact, it's totally contingent on how far you need to go to get into the next circle. If it's halfway across the map, you need to leave much earlier than right when the zone closes. This will be difficult because you're not going to know where the zone is pulling until you land, but it is something you need to think about within those first 30 seconds of landing. It's very similar when you leave for a commitment in real life. You usually want to plan for some traffic. If you avoid all roadblocks as you rotate late, you should consider yourself lucky. And I would try not to make a habit of it this season. Tip number 2, I'm taking selective fights. I'm not trying to play other people's games. If they're sniping and my team isn't, I'm solely focusing on how can I close the gap, or we're just not going to give that enemy team these damage dealing opportunities. Now, this may sound easier said than done, but it's usually possible in most situations. Obviously, those situations where you're fighting a team and you're getting griefed by a third party with snipers from Narnia, yeah, there's not too much you can do about those moments. But when you figure out what guns your opponents are using, this should then gauge how you're going to take that fight or not. I often see so many players will entertain the idea of these poor trade-off scenarios, like when an enemy has a charge rifle and you have a flatline, and there's 70 meters between the two of you. There's no world in which you're going to get the better of that exchange, so don't even entertain it. This season, I'm going to be quick to either say, yes, we'll fight them and push them this way to avoid their sniping, or say, no, we'll take a fight that makes more sense over here because these guys are fighting and it's closer. This is simple sports psychology. If a team is trying to run a play on you, you have to learn how to play defense. And sometimes offense is the best defense, whereas other times you just gotta D up. This can also work on the flip side too. If your team is using ranged weapons, then don't feel obligated to close the gap until you get a knock or some clear opening. The one issue that I found with this is that if you're solo queuing and you're using a sniper but your teammates aren't, this can and usually will create somewhat of a conflicting playstyle for the team as a whole, and it generally has some risks to it. But really don't let that stop you. If you want to run a sniper and your teammates don't, hey, go for it. I'm just saying, think about the differences in playstyle as you go about taking on a team. Players can have different motives game to game, contingent on what guns they're using. Tip number 3, following the meta. The meta has shifted in Season 14 and I'm heavily focused on it. I always find it interesting to see how a change here or a change there can wind up making such a huge difference in Apex. So I'm trying to stay up to date with what's good and what's not. This will also help me when it comes to countering or combating the current legend and weapon meta. So right now the legend meta is centering around legends like Vantage, Horizon, Valkyrie, Newcastle, Seer, Bloodhound, Octane, Caustic, Mad Maggie, and a couple others. These legends provide a diverse amount of abilities and requires a lot of thinking to realize what's possible game in and game out. The Seer meta is really difficult to deal with, as there's usually no real counter to wall hacks. I mean, yeah, of course, you can destroy his ultimate if you see it, but that's not always possible, and he'll still have his passive. However, this is very similar to how it's been previously in Apex when just about every team ran a Bloodhound, Caustic, or Gibraltar. How do teams counter it? Well, they had to have one on their team too. See, Apex has a huge reactive component to metas, and it's important to understand why that is. If a team scans you with a Bloodhound, there's no counter. but if you scan back yourself, then you basically have equalized their edge over you. The same thing works with a caustic. Let's say a caustic team wants to push another team indoors, and that team indoors doesn't have a caustic. Well, the caustic team is going to feel way more confident about pulling off that push. As far as the weapon meta goes, well, I can't remember a time where there have been so many different weapons that are actually viable. It feels like sniper and marksman rifles are really strong right now, and part of that is because Vantage is so popular at the moment, and her ultimate is being paired with other long-range guns like the G7 Scout, the 3030, and the Skullpiercer longbow. With the reemergence of the Volt, R, and Wingman back to floor loot, well, those are definitely back in the meta too. Most of you know the EVA 8 got buffed like crazy too, which is giving another viable option for shotguns. I mean, there's just so many good options to use this season beyond the normal R301, Flatline, and Peacekeeper combo. I did cover all the legends and weapons in 2 different tier list videos, so check those out after this one if you're interested. Tip number 4, I'm not being apprehensive with my playmaking. Stalling will get you killed. Apex is often a game of seconds. If you make the wrong move through action or even inaction, you will fail to succeed. And obviously no one wins every fight or every game that they play, but I found just having the goal to win the majority of fights that I get into sets me up for some positive outcomes. If I lose a fight, I try to figure out why. Was it something I missed, like an audio or visual cue that changes the circumstances of the fight? Did I misinterpret something my teammates said or did? I mean, context is super important and communication is no exception. Or did the opponent just execute better than me? Was I outnumbered? I mean, there's always a reason for a death or a kill, and I like to get to the bottom of it so that I can learn what works and what doesn't. I always want to know how to react to any given situation and also how to be proactive in them too. This gets easier with time and experience, which I know a lot of you have now. Apex is getting more and more difficult, but if you truly want to improve, start looking at the small stuff. I have a saying that I tell to some players that I coach: if you don't pay attention to the what and the why, then you'll miss out on the how. What the enemy is doing and why they're trying to do it will always contribute to how they are going to do it. It's like it all boils down to some Apex equation. Now, despite Apex getting more and more difficult, it's somehow at the same time making the game more rewarding when you do succeed. I think that's what keeps me going back to Apex. Tip number 5, I'm looking for lots of damage dealing opportunities. Some will think, well, duh, yeah, I want to deal more damage. But look, if you're constantly looking at the match summary and you're dealing less damage than your teammates, you want to look for more opportunities. Here's how you can do that. More opportunities has a lot of variables and nuance to it, but you want to try to be aware of where your enemies are and how many of them there are. Some fights in Apex can be a game of just weighing down your opponents over time. Deal 40 damage, re-peek, deal 100 damage, get cracked, heal, re-peek, get a knock, then push, wipe the squad. So you need to be active in these fights and play to the strengths of your positioning, loadout, and current inventory status. The simplest solution to dealing more damage is providing more presence in the fights you come across. Remember to abuse cover and high ground whenever possible, and assess your positioning advantage or disadvantage at all times. If you're running out of ammo, you need to consider the way you're looting. If you're not using the right loadouts for the types of fights you're getting into, you need to consider your playstyle. Some people say Apex is a game of dealing damage, whereas others have said to me it's a game of trying to take as little damage as possible. Well, I find it to be a game of both. Having both of these in your favor is the sustainable way to win the majority of your fights. Tip number 6, trying to be a better listener and communicator this season. Even if I'm solo queuing, I'm trying to make more callouts that I think are beneficial for my teammates to know. I've noticed some improvements in the overall solo queue experience by doing this. I also notice, even if players don't say a word, my communication can still help lead the team. Of course, it doesn't always work out, but when it does, it feels like a truly earned win, as I've learned that when you solo queue and succeed, the highs can be really high. At the same time, if someone is clearly being whack, I just mute them. But the majority of times, people hop on the mic throughout the game because they are playing off of the communication I'm giving. If they don't, it is what it is. But being a good listener centers around just taking in the little things I hear in Apex, but also what my teammates may be saying. This is a hard skill to have, especially in these very hectic moments during a fight in Apex. But it goes a long way if you can learn to listen to what your teammates are saying when they call out damage numbers or positioning of your opponents. Remember, time is of the essence in these moments, so being able to take in info and respond to it is critical. We all give Apex a hard time about their audio, and yes, at times it can be rough. But I have to say, after analyzing so much footage in Apex, what I've come to find out is the majority of times I actually just miss the audio cue. Like, my mind is so focused on something else or what's in front of me that I didn't hear the guy behind me. So I would just encourage players to think about that a little bit more in Season 14. However, on the topic of communication, if you want to learn about 10 things you should avoid doing this season, well, I covered everything in this video here. Check it out next. Peace.